definitely. I mean, it was so long ago when I read it, I'd forgotten much of the ending of the book. And it's like, whoa, whoa.
Just to jump on with what Jennifer had said, if you can see the movie, it is such a departure. Yet what the directors and producers
I've got
extracted
some
from
pictures from the movie for you in
the
my little
book,
slideshow here.
excellent.
It also
Yeah.
explained a few things that I missed.
Yes,
Mhm.
Like what?
That musical instrument,
the balalaika.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure I read that word and didn't know what it was.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
the
another
balalaika.
character. That's all.
I almost bought a left-handed balalaika, but my better judgment took over. And then I looked at the prices of them, and considering the economic climate, I decided, no, no, for you to play a balalaika badly for $600 is not a good idea, Peter. So forget about it.
Massive tariffs on balalaikas.
Oh, can you imagine?
Can you imagine $4 million?
But he'd never be able to even pronounce it. Go ahead, Jenny.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the economy, which was mentioned towards the end of the book, but sort of a little bit before that. And I think this explains a lot of what we were seeing in the book going on. So during the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921, they were in what they called war communism. And the goal was to ensure that the Red Army was adequately supplied with resources and to centralize the control of the economy to support the war effort was the whole point of this. So the key policies of that were the nationalization of industry. The Bolsheviks nationalized the major industries, including factories, banks, transportation, aiming for state control over production. They forced requisition of agricultural products. The state seized surplus grain and other food products from the peasants, which of course led to widespread famine and hardship. Centralized control. The Bolsheviks introduced strict centralized management of the economy, including the rationing of food and other commodities, and state control of foreign trade. Some of this sounds interesting in the light of today. The suppression of private enterprise, private trade, and private ownership were largely abolished, with the state taking control of all aspects of the economy. And then, of course, forced labor, which we got a taste of on the train ride with the people that were being sent. Workers were subjected to strict discipline, strikes were forbidden, and the introduction of forced labor for both civilians and the military. So as we know, we go back to characters in this last section that were taking part of that. So what happened as a result of this was severe economic hardship, including widespread famine, hyperinflation, and a decline in industrial production. So this led to the Kronstadt Rebellion in March of 2021. And what happened there, the sailors who were at Kronstadt in the fortress in the Gulf of Finland, which is right over Petrograd at the time, now St. Petersburg, they supported the Bolsheviks in 1917. But during the Civil War, they lost faith in the Bolsheviks due to the food shortages and their restricted freedoms. So the urban workers started having strikes and demonstrations about the lack of food and everything was going on. So the sailors joined them and formed a provisional revolutionary committee demanding Soviets without Bolsheviks, economic reform, establishment of political freedom and civil rights, and then the release of non-Bolshevik socialists from prison at the end of the Communist parties and to end Communist Party dictatorship. So they put their little group together. Sadly, however, Trotsky and Tukhachevsky led a force that crushed these rebels and shooting and imprisoning all the survivors. However, even though all of this happened, Trotsky then realized that they needed to do something different. And so what came next was the NEP, the new economic policy brought up in page 552, where they returned to Moscow. They're just starting this, what's called the NEP. And they're actually guys referred to as Nepmen or Kuklas who were part of this. So at the 10th Party Congress at the end of March of 1921, after the revolt in the early part of March, they decide to set up this whole thing. So the policies of this were the return of agriculture, retail trade, and small-scale light industry went back to private ownership and management. Money was reintroduced into the economy in 1922. There was no money during this other part of it. Peasants could own and cultivate their land, but they had to pay taxes to the state. And then the state retained control of heavy industry, banking, transportation, and foreign trade. But the NEP was viewed by the Soviet government as merely a temporary expedient to allow the economy to recover while the communists solidified their hold on power. In 1925, Nikolai Bukharin had become the foremost supporter of the NEP, while Trotsky was opposed to it and Joseph Stalin was sort of non-committal. The NEP was dogged by the government's chronic inability to procure enough grain supplies from the peasants to feed the urban workforce. So in 1928 and 29, these grain shortages prompted Stalin, by then who was the country's leader, to forcibly eliminate the private ownership of farmland and to collectivize agriculture under the state's control. That ensured the procurement of adequate food and supplies to cities in the future. This abrupt change in policy was accompanied by the destruction of several million of the country's most prosperous private farmers, and it marked the end of the NEP. It was followed by the reimposition of state control over all industry and commerce by 1931. So as you can see, that a lot of the starvation and things that were happening that we saw were as a result of that. So what I have now, just to follow up a little bit, is about the movie. Here, for those who've never seen the movie, this is Varikino, the house, the main house that they weren't allowed to be in the snow of the winter when they arrived. The movie won 5 Academy Awards, starring Julie Christie and Omar Sharif. It won for Best Musical Score, Best Cinematography, Best Writing for a Screenplay based on material from another medium, Pasternak's book, Best Art Direction, Set Direction, Color, and Best Costume Design Color. And though it did not win for Best Picture, reviews were mixed, calling the film literate, romantic, soul-filling, old-fashioned, and this must have been, Nabokov said, an honest failure, since he was busy trashing it anyway. So just some pictures for those who haven't seen the movie. So on over on this side, let me get my little arrow here. This picture right here, this is Komarovsky and Laura when she's 16. They're dancing at the party. This is Yuri and Tanya and Laura all at the Christmas party where she shot Komarovsky, and they are together, so you can see them. This is Strelnikov and Laura on the right. This is with him. They put a big scar on him in the movie. It sounded like in the book, I pictured him being a little cuter in the book. This is Yuri and Tanya outside Varikino and the thing while she's pregnant, right before he gets kidnapped. Here's Varikino, and here's the house where they lived here over on the side with the garden, and then that was the main house that they were not supposed to be in. Then here we see Yuri with Tanya and Tanya's father all at the train station. And then this is Tanya, her daughter, that Komarovsky, dumped, and she grew up. And then next to him is Evgraf, and that's Yuri's half-brother. Evgraf is with her. And of course, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, they frame it by taking this mysterious daughter who doesn't know who her parents are, and Evgraf finding her and trying to realize that she's Yuri and Laura's daughter. And that's how the movie starts. And then it goes all the way back to the start of the book. And then the book culminates in that. But I thought you might like to just see some of the pictures from that. And there's Yuri and Laura having a quiet meal together.
Classic.
That's the classic shot from there, and their Russian things. They did some good. If you go on IMDb to Dr. Zhivago, you can see tons of great pictures. So I just thought I'd pop up the questions here for us. Do our assessments of the major changes change our ideas in the last section of the novel? How can you explain Evgraf's inclusion and prominence in these pages? Why do you think Pasternak has Tanya tell her story at the end? She almost has the last word. And then the importance of the quote there from 612, where we talked about the history, and then also the ending, the last section, which we can go back to, but I just thought I'd pop those up there. So let me stop the share so we can get off to our discussion. There we go. All right.
Okay, so who wants to start it off? Comment, question, whatever. All right, yes.
Excuse me. I just want to discuss why Yuri didn't want to leave with Laura and that creepy lawyer and leave the country.
Okay.
So my opinion is, I first off, how he could let her leave with that creep again is beyond me by herself. Number two, I just thought maybe he is living in this la land where he can just do what he wants to do. He doesn't have to worry about his wife. He's not going to worry about Laura. If he would go with Laura, then he would maybe feel obligated to find his wife and children and not then stay with Laura. I don't know. I was kind of confused why he didn't want to go with her.
That's interesting because Komorowski did mention to him, this by going with me, you'll have an avenue
Right.
to go back to your family. Right. I mean, he did
Right.
say,
He offered either to get them back from Paris or to send him to Paris to get them.
yeah.
You
So
know,
what
he
did
was
the rest of
offering
you
his
think?
help.
Yeah, that was a great statement or comment. How did the rest of you respond to Yuri's?
Refusal to go with them.
Yeah.
It felt like a jealous, petty temper tantrum to me, frankly. Like every time he's seen this guy, he reacts poorly. Like, I'm not listening to you. Go away. Ew, I hate you. And I don't know, it felt like a jealous, petty temper tantrum.
Can anybody, I'm not into particularly defending Yuri at all, but can anybody defend him for the decision or I guess, explain it in a different way?
I thought he might be a
But
liability.
was on mute. I think he's an indecisive character. Time and time again, he couldn't make up his mind about things, and he just didn't act, and things happened around him.
Okay, yeah. And Jen, you were going to say?
Thought and by the way, I agree with Derek. I didn't like Yuri. I thought he was the least strong. I thought the women characters were so much stronger than he was. But to give him a benefit of the doubt, perhaps he was worried he was an additional liability because he was wanted as well for his subversive poetry. And he was technically a deserter, right? Even though the partisans abducted him. Wasn't he classified as a deserter of the Red
Yes.
Army?
He had no release papers, so he was not officially released from them. He just left and went off. So he could have been, I mean, they were hunting him as well. I felt too that he hated Komorowski so much for what he'd done to Laura that there was no way he was going to go with her. But what I think is weird is why did he let Laura go with him?
Yes.
I mean, I guess he thought it was saving her to get her out. But if he was that horrible that you wouldn't want to be with him, why would you send her and her daughter off with him? And especially in this part, when you found out he was lying, Strelnikov wasn't even dead. And Strelnikov went to all that trouble, Pasha, to get back to her. And she was gone and he was alive.
Especially when Laura's like, oh, he's going to take me away. I've seen it. He's going to take me away. Oh, no. He'll never take you away. Womp womp.
Was
So
Yuri-
I haven't
Debbie
wasn't at
Downer.
the last two classes to hear all of the other Yuri hatred. But I do feel like, to a certain extent, his first marriage really was an arranged marriage. He had no say-so in the marriage to Tanya, right? The mother basically dictated it, and his stepmother, whatever you want to call her. I do think he had an adult love with Laura, and maybe that was his way of sacrificing himself or his love for her to let her go, possibly. When we get to Marina, that's where any conviction I had to him, he just reverted to, I'm sorry for the men in the room, but a man that needs a woman to take care of him. So he fell apart. He's fallen apart so many times. And then his brother is the person who, it was really his singular savior again and again. He had the means to save him. I think he was a lot of people had appreciation for his poetry and whatnot, but really Evgraf was the only one that could ever come in financially. And Yuri made a mess of his life at least 3 times, maybe more.
Well, it's interesting because we're not even waiting for Derek here.
No, we're jumping in. I've never been a particularly artisty person. I realize I'm making up a word here, but some of the interviews that I've heard with, I'll call them bona fide artists, they almost feel they need to be tortured in order to create. the true works of art that they wanted. Could that be part of Yuri's issue, that he just had to make himself miserable again?
I do think a lot of artists, you know, the suffering is like a big thing. I also think he lived part of his life in the clouds, with his head in the clouds, thinking about different things. Like, you know, when they went to back to Varikino, and he was spending all night writing, like day and night, till he practically put himself into a state, so that when Komorowski came, he wasn't really even fully thinking, because he was so busy writing all the time. And then he would go off on these things and be by himself. I think a lot of that was his personality, and that he had a hard time dealing with the reality of like day-to-day life. It's like if I recall in the beginning, when he came back from World War I, and Tanya was like taking care of the children and, you know, making decisions and sort of everything going, he was having a hard time fitting in there with everybody, getting back into social life. And for a lot of them, he would just, it was easier for him to be alone, or just to be with one person like Laura, than to be having to deal with more people.
What do
I
you
do like that he left him with a bottle, though. Reading through that section, going, oh, and he left him left him a bottle. Well, that's great.
Have some liquor and just.
I thought he was very selfish.
Mm.
You know, they're living in these impossible times. I thought it was very selfish with all that writing also. And then I thought maybe I'm just not, you know, enough of into poetry. But I'm like, how is this helping the world? You spending all this time poetry. You've no food, you're freezing to death, like they're coming after you, they're wolves. And he's just writing and writing. And it's like, you've got Lara and her daughter, and you're just, and you think about it, both of the men in Lara's life sacrificed her for what they believed in, right? Strelnikov abandoned her for the cause, and Yuri kind of abandoned her for his poetry, and because he was indecisive about his obligation to his family and her and all of that.
But in the movie, I didn't see it, but in the book, she always still held Cernikov with such high regard. And that was very surprising to
She
me.
does in the movie too.
Yeah.
in Yuri's writing, there's a lot of religious influence that you don't see in his life. I seem to be a
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Sort of to turn just for a moment away from Yuri, when you mentioned how, okay, so Strelnikov abandons Laura, Yuri abandons Laura. So how do you figure in Komorowski? He becomes such an interesting character. I mean, he's one of the, to me, one of the more interesting. I mean, okay, yeah, he's you know, essentially a child rapist. I understand that. I mean, you know, so I didn't want Jen to sort of, you know, get back at me for that. But you know, there's a certain loyalty that he has towards Laura. You know, I mean, in a sense, and this is, you know, this might be completely going out, you know, on a limb, but in a way, he seemed to have an attachment to her that was stronger than either of the other two men. He wanted to save her. I don't really think he cared that much about, you know, Yuri at all. I
Maybe
think
it's
that,
because he didn't have anything else. Like Yuri had his poetry, and Strelnikov had the Bolshevik cause. Maybe Komorowski was so he didn't have that depth, and the only thing he had was this obsession with Lara, who never returned his affections. Well, I guess she did in the beginning, right? Because she was kind of enamored
But
of
he
the
was
adventure.
yeah, she was definitely enamored of.
successful lawyer. I mean, or businessman.
He swindles
Right.
his dad, and I guess was taking care of Laura's stepmother. I
Heather.
lost who that was,
Other,
but
yeah.
He was an opportunist.
for sure.
Yeah, I'd forgotten too, with Yuri not wanting to go with him, that he had killed Yuri's father. Yuri felt his father was driven to death by Komorowski, took all his money, and was there when he committed suicide. that he was sort of part of that as well. So he had both things going against him. You know, when he thought of it, Komorowski, he keeps coming back, but it was sort of interesting, that whole part where Laura doesn't remember what happened to her, but suddenly her baby's gone because he didn't want a kid around.
Mm,
And,
mm.
you know, she went with him, and I don't know how he arranged that. That was sort of a vague section about, you know, she was out of it, and then the next thing she came to and her kid was gone and she had no idea where her child was and, you know, what had happened to her. But Komorowski sort of, he wanted Laura back to go with him, but he didn't want, I don't know what, and then there was no mention of what happened to Katenka, where she ended up. But the
Yeah,
fact that he sort of engineered getting Laura away from Yuri, because I think he knew all along Yuri wouldn't come with them. I mean, I was pretty sure he knew that, so that he could get Laura back with him and take her out towards Vladivostok, where he was going, and then arrange to unload that baby and have her. And yet she ends up back in Moscow. She leaves him somehow and ends up back in the city. And that's a long trip from you know, Vladivostok back to Moscow.
why do you think that Pasternak sets up those three guys the way he does? And another related question is, okay, so because it is a love story, because it's very, very much a story about interesting people's lives, and that catches us. I wonder, like, how do the actions of all, bring in Strelnikov too, in terms of the sort of overarching concerns of the book, how do these three guys, I mean, like, we could just take Strelnikov, like, why, Strelnikov becomes, a real actor in the last section. Why does Pasternak put him in the position?
I was concerned with him that in the beginning, he was such a strong character. He had a command of presence and people and decision making. And in the end, he's equivocating and ends up committing suicide. It seemed inappropriate for an action for him.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
what about him or the circumstance turned him off?
Yeah, and also that he didn't seek out his own family, who he could have seen.
Mm.
He
In
was
fact,
Yeah,
so the relationship of these men with their children is another dynamic. None of them have any attachment to their children. Yuri didn't, Sternikov didn't. I think, Yuri didn't have a father figure in his life. Well, the stepfather, but not his own father. And I mean, maybe Sternikov did, but anyway, for whatever reason, they never really developed any relationship or sought out their children.
Jonakov was also kind of abandoned by his cause because he was never a Bolshevik, right? He was a freedom fighter, but he wasn't a Bolshevik. And at that time, it didn't matter whether you were one of like the revolutionaries if you weren't in with the Bolshevik. Like that's why the Bolsheviks still wanted to kill him, because even though he did a lot for their cause, he wasn't of them. So he was, I mean, if they found him, they would have killed. I mean, they had, they were going to kill him regardless. So he has this cause that he had sacrificed everything for, his family, his safety, everything for this revolutionary cause. And then when the revolution happens, it suddenly has nothing to do with him. And so everything that he had believed in, everything he had done was no longer, didn't care about him anymore. So I mean, what do you have when you have that left? And he also knew that if he had sought out Laura, I mean, in the end, he's still a liability for her because she gets sent to the camps regardless. But, in the end, he knew that if he went to his family, it was a death sentence for them as well as for him too. So in a sense, like, I actually don't fault him all that much for never finding his family, because if he had found his family, he'd be condemning them just as badly as he himself had been condemned.
Yep, it's
At
almost
least
redemptive
that's
for him in a
why
way.
I read it. He never went back to his family, even if he would have loved to see them.
Except
What-
for at the end where he came for them, they weren't there. He
Yeah.
finally ambled back to meet up with them, and then they were gone. But it was fascinating that he cared that Laura loved him when Yuri told him, how passionate she was about him. But yeah, did he ask about Katenka? He really asked about Laura. Tell me more about what Laura thought. I don't, Katenka, who cares? Yuri had the one dream about his son where he was worried about him being abandoned, and would sort of mention him from time to time, but none of them like climbed over hill and dale to get to their kids. I mean, they went through everything to do everything else but their children.
And so how does that, if you take that idea of their apparent lack of concern about their kids, how does that relate to, say, the larger issues of Russia?
I think it represents this idea of the individual is not important anymore. It's the collective. And what's more individual than our relationships with our immediate family? Right? If I'm not supposed to be so attached to my daughter because I'm supposed to worry about all of Russia's children. Right? It's not so much the individual anymore, it's the good of the state and all that.
So do you think that as we read, we're thinking of that as being a major flaw in the Russia of the days that we've read about?
A flaw of communism.
A flaw of communism? Yeah.
And I mean, none of our characters are so happy about what's going on in Russia, with the exception of Strelnikov, who is very committed to a specific cause. The rest of them kind of go with whatever's going to keep them alive.
Yeah.
Right? Especially Yuri.
I'm hesitant to ascribe all of that to communism, though. I think a lot of that is also cultural. And going back to gender roles and the roles of fathers and family, like Soviet, modern, whatever, the role of the father, at least like based on my experience and like they're not necessary, like active fatherhood is not a very big priority right back there. It was the mother took care of the kids, the fathers didn't care. I mean, and then also if you look at lifespans, men didn't live very long, especially compared to women. So I want to say, like, at least when I was over there, the average lifespan of a Russian male was in its like 50s, early 60s, whereas women, it was about 15, 20 years longer. So the men weren't even living long enough to be grandparents in a lot of these ways. So I don't know if it's a communist thing. I think it's also a cultural, a gender role, gender dynamic, family dynamic that's been around. It predated communism, and it postdated it as well.
Wouldn't it be also from all the wars they've been through, like all the millions of men that were killed from like the Napoleonic era and on, that there were very few men, so the women were left doing a lot because the men, look how long of a period they were at war all the time. I mean,
Even
from the
when I
siege
was
of Leningrad,
there,
like on, they're nonstop. World War I, World War II, their own revolution, Napoleon's invasion. Russia was under, a lot of men were in the military and were never home and never made it home.
there were a
And
lot
really-
of badass women fighting over dirt bags when I was because there are so few men, and not having a man is worse than anything else. So when the pickings are slim, I mean, I don't mean to
there are
sound
so
really,
few.
I don't
but
want to sound like such this like cold-hearted person, but when I was living over there, I'm just remembering the people that I was friends with and who I was interacting with, because I was teaching a lot of college students and seeing the dynamics. And oh boy, howdy, man, the pickings are slim. So.
Rachel and Jenny, the whole concept of fatherhood does not work in any part of this novel where they would actually want to stay and be, part of the family, because it would, keep them from, continuous military service. So I just can, constantly see that whether it was communism, Stalin, Lenin, all the way through, it doesn't work. And Jenny, I'm still pondering what was it, women of highest honor if you have
Mother
10
heroine
kids?
for 10 or more children, the Mother Heroine Award.
That was just such a fascinating part of the story. But no, to me, everything about what it means to be a good father, beyond provider, being involved, just really doesn't work in this system.
And is there a reason they always refer to it as Mother Russia? Like, it's obviously not Father Russia, but they always think of Russia as a woman. Like when they speak of it, it's Mother Russia, the homeland is so important. They can't leave Russia because they're so attached to it. I mean, even Pasternak himself, like Yuri, had no intention of ever leaving the country, like going to Paris to join Tanya for a better life, because he could not bear to be away from Russia. And in real life, Pasternak could have left Russia and been happy. And look at people like Navalny, that who left Russia and didn't have to go back knowing he could be killed, but he went back. You know, that draw to the country itself is fascinating to me.
Grammatically, the Russian word for land is feminine, declines feminine.
Is it? There we
The
go.
Russian
Thank you.
word for Russia declines feminine, so it could be as simple. I don't know, but the grammar of it is feminine. I don't know the etymology behind that, but
Yeah. You know, the thing too that Stalin was viewed as such a strong father figure, right? I mean, he was the father of the country. He was frequently photographed surrounded by children, and the end of the novel, in terms of, I mean, we go through this like, whoa, quick move in in the time span. I mean, we're really in the early 50s by the time the novel ends, and then and then previous to that, we were in, I think, 1943, the very last section. So I guess I'm wondering whether part of part of what Pasternak was showing us was the failure of or the failure because there was the lack of a kind of fatherhood. You know what I'm saying? Because what if Stalin was the sort of the father figure, well, ultimately he failed them. Ultimately he failed, and we see in the other characters, the characters who are the father figures, a different but still a very real failure as as fathers.
Doc, are you talking about Evgeny and Komarovsky as father figures?
In general, yeah, in general, I mean, the father figures that seem to show care are, his uncle, Yuri's uncle, um, Sonia's dad, right? And they seem to take on these, maybe unusual roles in, given what Rachel has just been, telling us, in terms of taking on what and again, we're outsiders, we're looking in, I'm making judgments about, well, you don't treat your children this way. And whether you're Stalin and and your children are Russians, or whether you're Yuri and your children are in France and their children who he really never got to know. I don't know. That's just I was just trying to think of like the sort of the sweeping reasons why Pasternak would make all of his major characters questionable as dads.
is that where maybe Yevgraf comes in? Because it often felt like Yevgraf ex machina, because something would happen and he would just sweep in and magically save the day. But in a way, he kind of was, for lack of a better word, paternal to Yuri, because he saved his ass multiple times. Like, here's a place to live, here's a way to get out, here's some money. Like, he wasn't actually there for him, but he was definitely doing a lot behind the scenes to keep
He was
Yuri.
kind of an enabler.
Well, I guess
The
that
ultimate
too.
enabler.
Yeah.
But you
But
know,
the fact that Evgraf then seeks out this child, I'm curious how he even would have known that Lara was pregnant.
He was in LeCheka though, wasn't he? I mean, he probably knew everything.
Right. He was
Because
very
Yuri
high
never
up in
knew,
the government. They knew everything about everybody.
but
So
Yuri never knew Lara was pregnant,
he
right?
did know. They talk about it. He did know she was expecting. He said,
Laura?
Because he was
yeah,
a doctor. He pieced it
Yes,
together. It was
he
his
knew.
Well,
medical training.
I remember
Yeah.
with Tanya that he said that discussion.
No, there's a section here where he does actually mention it, that he said Laura was not feeling well and she thought she was pregnant and he wasn't sure
Okay.
whether that was the case, but that she was having like morning sickness. So
yeah.
All right. My bad.
Back to
was a
the
while
idea
ago.
of fatherhood, in a lot of literature and in life, a father represents stability also. And they were living in such unstable times. So could that have been part of why all of our characters were such lousy fathers?
Well, what about Marina's father? He didn't seem to like Yuri, but yet he shoved his daughter to Yuri because Yuri's like, I'll do my stuff myself. No, 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 you take my daughter, she'll clean for you. And then, of course, he has a relationship with her. That seems kind of
and
like
cranks out 2 more kids that
Yeah.
he's not paying any attention to.
We're very happy to welcome Derek to
Greg said
the.
I missed all the Yuri bashing.
Well, no.
I'm pissed.
We've done some, but we wanted to save a little bit for you. Since you already told Ginny that you were, delayed and couldn't quite get to us as soon as you could.
I mean, Yuri at the end of this, I mean, it's his moral character is, I don't know, dust, honestly. What I said to Ginny was, it's funny because when you watch the movie, there is no mention of the third woman with the 2 kids. Like that isn't even, that's glazed completely over. So I can almost understand if you only watch the movie, you're like, oh, well, Yuri's this big romantic and this and that and the other thing. But you read the book and like, he's just a cheating bastard, honestly, at the end of the day. I mean, that's all it amounts to, which is what my son said, by the way.
What kind of language is that for your son to be using?
It's what I didn't necessarily approve of it, but I thought it was quite apropos, honestly. Don't forget selfish, self-absorbed, and tortured. All of that, goes in.
Yep. I thought it was interesting on page 540, I can't remember my 542, there was a paragraph with Strelnikov, and it was sort of an interesting statement that sort of talked about a lot of this. He's talking about how he's outpouring his heart. This was the sickness of the age, the revolutionary madness of the epoch. In thought, everyone was different from his words and outward show. No one had a clear conscience. Each with good reason could find himself guilty, a secret criminal, an unexposed deceiver. On the slightest pretext, a rage of self-castigating imagination would play itself out to the utmost limits. People fantasized, denounced themselves, not only under the effect of fear, but also drawn on by a destructively morbid inclination of their own free will, in a state of mere physical trance and passion for self-condemnation that once set loose could not be stopped. I thought that was a pretty powerful paragraph of how people in this time of war, that their thoughts and what they outwardly did were never really reconciled, and they could be. Anyway, that was just
That's
to me
kind
an
of commentary on the whole thing, right? I mean,
interesting passage.
everybody wanted reform and justice and that sort of thing. But in actuality, when the revolution came around, it was just this violent chaos everywhere. I mean, I think it had great intentions to start with, but in reality, it ended up unraveling and becoming something that was hideous.
And couldn't that be said in many war situations? I
Absolutely.
mean, the German people certainly did that too. I mean, a lot of them turned in Jews because it's them or me. I need to do what I can do to survive. And a lot of perfectly good people do perfectly horrible things just to survive. And so maybe we're being a little hard, Derek.
No, he could. He could.
War makes us do crazy things, kind of.
I
thing.
understand, but he didn't have to go and impregnate 3 different women and like you go. I mean, come on, that's a stretch.
What else is there to do? Shots of vodka and, have all
Write
the
poetry.
Faldo. Yeah,
More
roaming.
poetry writing, less fooling around.
The movie didn't really delve into the privation that the book does. That's another thing. It really is a love story set in a revolution, whereas the book is about how history affects individuals.
I do think that they didn't quite say it out loud, but maybe that he is a romantic and he writes all the poetry. Maybe he had, for lack of a better term, like a 21st century term, but maybe he did have a lot of game and he was charismatic. I mean, the woman that the third woman, Marina, that, he has 2 kids with, she's sobbing uncontrollably right at the funeral. Like she's lost. And he's only known her for a fraction of the time compared to Tanya and Laura. And just maybe that's more this, kind of where Yuri's coming from, is that maybe he had that ability to just charm women and could go
And
with it.
Tanya doesn't seem to be that mad about the Lara thing. Like they become friends when he's been kidnapped by the partisans.
So I
And
just
so how do you
remembered, don't we
explain
have
that?
to, sorry,
Oh.
don't we have to keep in mind that this is somewhat autobiographical of Pasternak, right? Wasn't he a cheater? Like, and this is the whole
Yes.
thing, is like being very interested in Russian stuff and living there. It's like, we can talk about this story until the cows come home, and like it's built around the revolution and all the craziness, but like it's also him,
Right.
Pasternak.
He was married twice, and then during
Yeah.
his second marriage had a lifetime affair with the woman that both of them stayed till the end. And he never stayed overnight with Olga. He spent all day with her and then would go back home to Zanadia at night and spend the night with her and then come back in the daytime. But he kept the relationship with both those women his whole life, as well as he had a first marriage and children with that woman. So a lot of what's in the book was him. You're
Him.
right.
But
Within
I don't
it,
think,
within
but
life.
to me though, reading it, I think that's a great point, Ethan. I think we're all thinking it, but to me, this book doesn't quite sell it like he's justifying it, Pasternak, that is, through these characters. I don't feel like he's doing that. That's just me though. I mean, I don't think that he's writing this book for people to read it and be like, oh, it's cool if you go out there and impregnate
Oh no,
different
no,
people and
I
don't
am
give
not
a damn.
justifying child rapists and cheating at all. No,
Right,
I'm just,
right.
Or was he normalizing the cheating? That's what men do.
But this
Make-
book is classified as a love story. I do think the women loved Yuri. I'm not really sure Yuri in the end loved anyone, not even himself.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Did Strelnikov love Lara? And on that note, there's a line on page 547 towards the bottom. He says, I went to war so as to conquer her again after 3 years of marriage. What the heck does that mean? I don't understand that.
I feel like from the when he first abandoned her, it was like he needed to prove himself. Like I think he had like to conquer her, like he needed to like prove to himself that he was worth her. Like I don't know if that's love or what you call that, but he was sort of a tragic figure in my eyes. Like she didn't want him to leave. He like made up all these issues in his head from the very beginning of like there's something wrong. I need to do something drastic. And I guess that was the answer. Like maybe he loved her, but I feel like he wasn't full enough of a character to like fully love someone else in my eyes. Or like he wasn't full enough, like sure of himself enough to like give himself to someone else, really.
It's really good.
Yeah, I thought he couldn't appreciate the kind of love she was trying to show him. I mean, he was thinking about killing himself, and yet she was crazy about him, and he couldn't accept the love in the way she was offering it, and did just go off. So, I think he did really love her. And I think when he said to conquer, by conquering, I think he meant conquering himself to pull himself together to be able to go back to her and really be able to express the fact he did love her, because he seemed so shocked as well when Yuri was telling him how much. I mean, didn't Laura at one point say, talking to Yuri, that she would crawl on her hands and knees across
Yes.
the countryside to go back to him if he was there? Like, she'd dump Yuri in a minute and crawl back to him.
Yeah.
So that although she liked Yuri and had a kid with him, she'd go right back to Strelnikov.
I have to admit I didn't finish this reading. But
All right. All right.
after hearing that from you all, your perspectives on him, when he shoots himself and then Yuri finds him, he describes the blood droplets as rowan berries, which
Yes. Excellent
like,
point.
they're
Excellent.
like in lore, protect from evil and witchcraft and kind of. So it's kind of interesting that he had it was kind of like he had an evil spirit, clouding his ability to love and be fully present and be a father.
And one thing that's it seems like, well, okay, Strelnikov has his love of his cause. Okay. And it seems like Yuri, when push comes to shove, his love is his poetry. And his poetry is an extension of himself. And so, you know, while, yeah, I think you could, I like what Tessa just said about his being a tragic hero. Well, if what is the biggest flaw of a tragic hero? I taught this in many different contexts at the academy.
They don't realize they are the hero.
Well, that's part of it. That could be part of it. But there's a characteristic. It's a Greek word. It begins with an H.
Hubris?
Hubris. Yes, hubris. And what is hubris?
Excessive pride.
Excellent. Excellent. It's excessive pride. So, if you see, that kind of works for me with Yuri, right? There was, even though he put himself down, he always separated himself from others. There was always something about him, whether it's, his poetry, whether it was his own concept of himself, it seemed to me was the example of hubris in that tragic character. In other words, you could never, once you show a hell of a lot of hubris, you're done, right? If you have too much hubris and you're a lead character, you're doomed.
That was the fall of Satan, was too much pride.
There you go. There you go. And I don't think we would necessarily make a comparison between Yuri and Satan, although it seemed like a few people were ready to do that. Perhaps Derek was, on the line of that. But yeah.
I just mean like literary.
Oh yeah.
Like
yeah.
The
yeah.
very old story, having pride be the fall.
Pride goeth before a fall.
Right.
Yeah. And the cool thing too is that, there's so much to this book, right? Like, we're talking about tragic heroes, we're talking about bad fathers, we're talking about Stalin. So if I may, just because I think I mentioned in the question that 50 years ago, when I first read the book and I finished the book, and we were in Dr. Novovo's class, and I was sitting there, sort of flummoxed by the ending. And I can't say that, he's a very good professor, but he never really came up with a satisfactory answer. But taking all that we've been talking about and looking at the end of the book, first of all, the one question is, why does Tanya get so damn much space? Why I mean, writers have choices. They can eliminate a character. I mean, we didn't have to see Strelnikov again. He could have been really killed and, all right, take away, but he comes back. Komarovsky, well, he might have been, there would have been many sort of political reasons why he may have, been knocked off, right? But he comes back. Well, here's a character who hasn't really even appeared before, and she gets major space at the end of the novel. What did you make of that?
I think she deserved it. In our mind, we all wanted to know what happened to Tanya, where is Tanya, what's going on with Tanya and the kids. And then she basically absolves him from all of his sins elegantly. And it's also a passing, I think, between the old world, which she represents, and the new world, which has all happened before us.
Okay.
I think that it took a long time for this book to be written, and Pasternak had the opportunity to look back and say, gee, something's missing here. Let me add something to explain this gap. So but she got written in a long way, and again, one of those examples where she talks and talks and talks and explains what happened, rather than having people interacting very much with it. So
Charles, along that line, it's a tidier ending, to have her bring so much of it. And she doesn't have all the baggage that so many of the other characters do. She's kind of pure and I wrote in here noble, to hear her story. So
I also
yeah,
think it's
maybe.
kind of Pasternak's way of putting in a feminine voice into the book. A lot of the story is told, I think, from a male perspective, a lot of until the end when finally we get to hear from a female and she gives it to us from a female perspective. I think maybe it's his way of balancing out whether or not he actually meant to, but I think it does kind of balance out the story. I love this book, I really did.
Well, what Ginny one of the pictures Ginny showed us was the Tanya at the beginning of the movie, right? And she's so utterly innocent looking. And I think, that innocence translates here, because in many ways she hasn't had the opportunity to really grow up, or she's grown up too fast. I suppose you could look at it two different ways. And I remember when I first finished the book, way back when, one of my big questions was, okay, so what happens to Tanya? What happens to her?
Well, I think it's interesting. She doesn't know who her parents are, really. She doesn't know what happened to her. She got abandoned on the streets. In the movie, she got separated from a man that was holding her, but in the book, they more or less just tossed her off to an orphanage. So the fact that they all come together and she doesn't know who her parents are, and Evergraph, once again, as we mentioned before, sort of serves like this person who comes out of nowhere to find her and sort of let her know who her parents are, and that to sort of look after her. And I think it's sort of the idea of a continuation of generations. We start with Yuri as a child who's lost his parents and his making his way through. And now here's Tanya, whose parents, Laura doesn't even know she has a daughter, or knows she has a child, but doesn't know what happened to her. I think Komorowski told her the child died, right? I think, that she lost the baby, so she didn't even know she had a daughter to be looking for her. But it sort of, I think, ties through the generations, and that Dudaroff and Misha Gordon, they end up sort of being the ones that pull the story from beginning to end through those various characters so that Yuri lives on and Laura lives on.
Yeah, that's good. So what did you make? I mean, again, I hope you can, it's not like it's something that, bothers me so that I don't sleep at night. Okay, but at, that the final passages, do you, and this was my whole shtick with Professor Nuovo, that the last paragraph, to the aging friends at the window, it seemed that this freedom of the soul had come, that precisely on that evening, the future had settled down tangibly in the streets below, that they themselves had entered into that future and henceforth found themselves in it. A happy, tender sense of peace about this holy city and about the whole earth, about the participants in this story who had lived till that evening, and about their children, filled them and enveloped them in an inaudible music of happiness which spread far around. And it was as if the book, of course, referring to all of the notes of Zhivago, in their hands knew it all and lent their feelings support and confirmation. After reading all I was reading, after finding out that I didn't really know what the hell was going to happen to Tanya, I thought Epigraph would be a good, he would be a savior, but there's a real cutoff there. Okay, what does Tanya's future like? And then there's this utterly positive, the word happiness is used frequently in that ending. And I'm telling you, I love this book, but if I were to find an adjective that I would never use, it would be happy. I don't see happy. What about this? Has been my problem with this.
What
damn
about
book.
peaceful? I don't see a whole lot of that either.
But where does it come from? Is it? You can get really cynical. And I don't like to do this, especially with writers, and saying, well, God Almighty, the guy had been over 600 pages. He had to end the thing, so he's telescoping time. He's rushing through decades, and then he comes with this idea of peace, joy, happiness.
Maybe it's happiness in the context of the Russian experience, which is very different than our definition of happiness.
Okay, but given what we have here in the book, where's the happy? I'm reading this and I'm saying, wait a minute, this is like kumbaya at the end. I am not kumbayaing at all as this book ends.
Doc, is it because they've made it through this terrible time? And then he starts attributing things to Moscow, which I just, if I'd been to Moscow, I'd feel similarly, but that I missed that. But there's light at the end of this tunnel. Is that where he was heading?
That it had been for the censors?
So when I was talking earlier, I was talking about Tanya, not Tanya.
Right.
And I'm wondering if if that was done on purpose, that somehow one has morphed into the other.
I think it's interesting. He named that the daughter was named Tanya, and the mother was Antonia, so she was Tonya. Like
that's what I'm saying.
T-O-N.
I got when you asked the question, that's who I went to.
I realized that's what you were talking about, was Tonya, the wife in Paris. But it's interesting, the daughter's name is Tanya, and he could have chosen any name for her. Why did he choose a name that was so close to the first wife's name? I do think, is he talking not about the book or the lives of the people in the book, but is he talking about the poetry at the end, that the happiness, the music of happiness is Yuri's poetry in a legacy to everyone? Because I don't see, like you, I don't see anything happy in this book. Everything happens bad to everybody. Yuri dies, Laura dies, Strelnikov dies, Komarovsky gets away and then he should be in prison. Nothing was really happy about this, but is he talking about that book of poetry, that the poetry is the music of happiness, and that Moscow as a city is the heroine of the story because it survived and it's still there.
That's really
and
good,
still
Jenny.
going. And that's sort of what I was thinking, because I read that like 4 times after you sent the questions out, trying to think myself. Because the first time I read it, I was like, "What is this man talking about?"
But at the end, they are there is some peace. They're not
Yes.
at war. It's not perfect. They're not built, they haven't restored, but at least they're not fighting. So maybe you enjoy the chirping of the birds or sitting at the window and feeling a breeze, the simple pleasures that are not happening at war.
You're right. It's 5 years later. They're looking out over the city. I mean, that sure sounds like hope to me.
Yeah, I wrote hope in a big thing at the bottom of the page. Like at least it ended with hope. You weren't feeling like it was so dismal.
That's what I thought, that maybe Russia, that Moscow was actually starting to come alive again, that people were coming back to the city. That's how I took it.
Yeah, and I agree with all of you, and I'm probably too much of a curmudgeon about this whole thing, but I'm looking at the evidence. And the evidence is we have Tanya's story, and her story is one of like incredible strength. Okay, so I feel good about that.
Maybe
What
it's
happened?
about survival and that generation, that this person who they did love, Yuri, and and there were good qualities about Yuri and Lara, that they live, even though they're gone, they live on in this young woman who survived. That it's the survival of the Russian people, regardless of all of the trauma that Russia survives and our people survive.
Yeah, I
This,
also sometimes like maybe I agree. I thought it was a little bit weird, like you're just like random, but maybe the idea is like, I think a lot of history, when you zoom in close, there is a lot of like suffering and bad, and especially in this time period. And maybe what the poetry allowed them to do was like zoom out. And a lot of times when you zoom out at history, like things are generally getting better, even like though when you zoom in, it's like a lot of tumultuousness. Overall, it like goes in a positive direction, or at least people think it's like a hopeful direction. So maybe that was the idea, like they were able to take a step back and say, like, you know what, there is still hope. I mean, she forgives her dad, like she forgives everyone, so there's hope in that. Like that going forward, they'll continue to learn from the mistakes. That's the only reason that I could think like makes sense of it, I guess.
I got to say, I think going back to what Ethan was talking about is that it's somewhat of a autobiography. And I just had to look it up because I forgot what it was. When they're breaking the third wall, that's when an actor realizes that they're actually characters. When I read the book, I read he was literally talking about Dr. Zhivago, and that he had laid it all out there and told you how everything was going to be. And that's kind of how I read it. When I read the book was in their hands, I immediately thought about myself with the book in my hands and what I had read.
okay. It's probably was my bad not to ask you to read all the poems, but then I figured, it's a really long book and I don't want an insurrection. But there may be something really important there. Yeah, that the idea is, well, what the hell were they holding in their hands? What was this book? Poetry?
It was the book of his poetry.
Well, yeah, but Derek is thinking of it as being the whole book.
Right, for us to think that, like we're holding this book as they're holding the poetry book.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Which I kind of, I like that idea. Good, lots of good thinking. So
I thought it was about his book of poetry, the Lara poems.
yes, well, I think
Was.
And
Yeah.
that, a lot of it is love, obviously.
Yeah.
his poetry, and maybe it's about the endurance of love and the beauty of love, and that even in the face of all of this chaos, love prevails.
So
And
you
that's
know,
all that survived of our characters were his poetry about Lara.
And the book circulated right at the end of the story, like his poems and his
Mhm.
book
They're
was out
published.
there like a bestseller type thing, right? It
Mhm.
was like that, right?
Yes. And
Yeah.
just like Pasternak actually published poems when he couldn't publish the book, he published the poems from the book were published in Russia,
Mhm.
but not the book. So he had put out the poetry in Russia and that got circulated. And our friend Nabokov said that he thought he was a great poet, a lousy author, but a great poet.
And isn't published writing a way of being immortal?
Sure.
So Yuri lives no matter what. If these poems are read and praised and lauded, he lives on.
Yeah. You know, well, so you've helped me deal with the 50-year-old problem that I've had with the ending. But I'll add one thing. I would have put the poems before the last conversation. They talk about the book. Let's see the book. Then at the end, okay, I can see the hopefulness. I can see, Mother Moscow, whatever. You know what I'm saying? So that's like a really, that's just my, issue. But anyway, so one of the first questions that I asked, and I think for the first week was like, how has this book become such a revered work in Russia, even in Putin's Russia? Why is it, I think I wouldn't have been surprised to have read, well, it's being taught now. I mean, after all, his son took the Nobel Prize for him, and, many, it's been praised for so long, but to become sort of a required reading in the 11th grade, how do you explain that? I have some ideas, but I'm just wondering, like, um, how does an authoritarian regime such as Putin's say, hey, this is okay, sure, we should read, all the kids should read Dr. Zhivago? Why do you think?
It's almost as simple as why is 1984 and Aldous Huxley being read? If everybody shuts those books down, it's almost like, oops, right? I mean,
I think it demonstrates resiliency, like, of
Huh?
Russian people. There's so much that goes on in this story, in relationships, in the government and politics, and just the climate and environment. And these people just, keep on going for the most part until the end when they all are like, where's my love?
I thought it demonstrates the strength and the enduring strength of Russians, and maybe it's also, say, hey, you think it's bad with me? That was pretty bad.
I had that thought too.
Like, stop your complaining.
Yeah.
I
It
think it
wasn't as bad as
minimizes.
Stalin, come on.
Right.
Yeah, right. I think it minimizes the individual and enhances the collective, and that may be the message that they're hoping to get out of it.
Hmm.
As I said,
Hmm.
when I first joined, which I guess was week 3, there's something for everybody if you want to focus, just on that and kind of ignore all of the other things. So it's
Definitely not Fidelity. I wouldn't say Fidelity is at the top of the list.
I think it's a good example of the value of a story and how you remember things better in a story. It gives the history of the time with an explanation of what happened with the revolution and how people have developed in the setting of a story that people read for the story. But along the way, a lot of history's there and some positive points about the communist system, although it's not, I wouldn't say it's a strong endorsement.
Could it also be that they control what the kids think about this book versus making it a taboo book that kids are going to read and make their own interpretation? This way the teachers control what's kind of how they interpret the book.
That certainly could be the case. I think, the idea is that, and my knowledge of Putin is pretty minimal, but I don't think he's ever in any way identified himself as being part of the communist elite, right? Because I don't think he is.
True. You are
He's
correct.
not a communist.
No.
No. So that in a sense, much of what gets attacked is in the novel was specific acts by communists, Bolsheviks, right? And, so you can sort of separate that from the world that exists now, right? Because anytime you're reading a book, obviously you're reading from your own own context. So kids in Russia today are reading about a time that they don't identify with. And even though we may, from the outside, speak of, oh, well, I mean, it's just authoritarian regime. I mean, hell, it's the same as that in much of Zhivago, but that's really just not true, right? I mean, that's not an accurate assessment of the novel and of the position that kids are in. So I guess I've sort of convinced myself that the reason it's an important book in lots of places, but also there, is that in an ironic sense, it doesn't really present the Russia of today, but it does present a kind of qualifier on the past. Does that make sense?
I think too, it presents a love for Russia
Oh,
throughout the book by all
right.
different people. And I think that's important to Putin, and to
Yes.
the push on. And I
Absolutely.
also think it's a sense of pride, to have an author that the world knows, that, is recognized, that, people know this book, whether it's through the book or through the movie, Pasternak, and this story. And that's a certain amount of pride for Russians, for the 11th grade student to read. This is a world-renowned author, from Russia. They have many renowned authors. And I think to reinforce that as a matter of pride, but also because it is a story where inevitably almost everybody in it loves Russia and would rather die in Russia in the worst circumstances than live somewhere else. And how can you not think that's an amazing thing about your country, that I would rather starve here,
Yes.
freeze to death, whatever happens, but I want to be here in Russia, and I'm not going to go. I could have left the country and gone somewhere and been happier, but I won't.
Yeah,
And
that
takes
at
pride.
and at all different levels too, Jenny.
Mhm.
It's a deep cross section of everybody that makes up Russia, and everybody does have that kind of pride, love of it, whether it comes in one form or an angle or another.
So who wants to have the last word? Is there something that we've not mentioned?
Yeah,
that's-
there is something. So, and I don't want the last word.
Well, you'll never really have him because, that's Ginny or I will take.
Sure. The movie, you can't have one without the other. The book release to the movie release is so close in timing, right? So
Mm.
that's another thing.
Within
you will
5
always,
years or so, yeah.
right, you'll always have the visual of the movie. So Omar Sharif, I think, was, very well cast. I just have to say, Julie Christie, she's just stunning. I mean,
Oh, God.
for a child watching the movie with my mother, and seeing this woman, like nobody's ever going to reach that level of beauty. That's all I
No,
have to
she's
say.
still like this cool old dame on the streets. Like if you look, she's still alive. Like she's super hip. She is. Like she's got this bob haircut and like wears yellow Converse and like she's cool like that.
Well, that being said, I do remember back in the days, because I was probably like in 10th grade when the movie came out, and it was just seriously. I mean, I was a little bit, slow on the social growth scale, but I'm sure that the presence of Julie Christie inhibited me in ever wanting to date anyone. Just because, like, well, God, I mean,
Who can stack up? The other one,
honestly, I mean, I was weird, for my age, but some of my friends were too. I mean,
did
there's
anyone think, and you know who Ewan McGregor is? Omar
Yeah.
Sharif and Ewan McGregor. I cannot unsee Ewan McGregor as Yuri in the original. I don't even think he was born back then, but like Omar Sharif and Ewan McGregor are doppelgangers for sure. Like I could not watch that movie and not just keep thinking I was watching Ewan McGregor or
Wow.
Obi-Wan, young
I gotta
Obi-Wan
say,
Kenobi.
Obi-Wan
Obi-Wan.
Kenobi playing the role of Dr. Zhivago.
Yep,
And-
Alec Guinness. Yep.
Force was with him.
Oh, I know. Yeah, having
And Alec Guinness looks a little bit like the oldest Brady brother also, just saying. But anyway.
Greg. He's Greg.
He does, right?
You've had a lot of time to think about these things, Derek, obviously. Well, listen, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. This has been terrific. I
Yes.
have to say I would have never had plowed through this book, and I really enjoyed it. And I loved the discussion. You guys were great. It was
Yeah,
really
you were
fun.
terrific.
And hopefully
Thank you for
next fall we'll have something else exciting coming up.